Welcome to Ohio Roots, the official podcast of the Ohio Genealogical Society. Join us as we embark on a captivating journey through Ohio's rich genealogy, history, and abundant resources. Hosted by me, OGS Executive Director Noel Poirier, this podcast brings you insightful conversations with a diverse array of guests, from OGS members, chapter leaders, and staff to renowned genealogists, historians, and influential figures within the genealogical community. Each episode delves into fascinating topics and captivating stories. So grab your headphones, hit that play button, and join us on this enthralling journey of Ohio's roots. If you love uncovering the stories hiding in military, court, and even patent records, you're going to enjoy today's guest, Michael Strauss. He's a military historian, professional genealogist, and an expert witness in kinship cases across several states. He's bringing 6 dynamic sessions to the 2026 Ohio Genealogical Society Conference, and today he's giving us a sneak peek. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Michael Strauss. Well, Michael Strauss, thank you so much for joining me today on the OGS Ohio Roots podcast to kind of preview what you're going to be presenting at the 2026 OGS conference. I really appreciate you taking some time today to talk to me about it. So let's get started. You've kind of have a career that's kind of the intersection of military history and genealogy. How do those two paths come together for you?
Well, they certainly come together in a number of ways, certainly through the use of publications, writing. They come together for me through lecturing and presenting. And, they come together for me in doing historical research. So in all 3 areas, it's really the intersection for me.
You've got, I think, 6 programs you're offering at the conference this year, and there's a really nice, diverse set of topics you're covering. How did you come up with your list?
Well, as my wife says, she's told me many times that I'm not a one-trick pony. And she said, you can do more than military. And I'm like, well, I love the military stuff, but she's right. I do enjoy and have other interests as well. And I really like it that OGS kind of took that to heart and kind of divided my 6 topics into 3 that were more or less military focused, and then 3 that were not. So it is a really nice, even mix.
One of the programs you've got coming up is one on non-combatants in the military, which I think is an interesting story that a lot of people don't consider. So when people think about that, military ancestors, they tend to think of them being soldiers or their role as being soldiers. Talk about a little bit who these non-combatants were.
Well, and you're spot on when you're talking about that specific group. So non-combatants is kind of a complex subject, I think, to discuss, in that, and the title says following the armies. So one would assume that those non-combatants would have been blacksmiths, they would have been sutlers, they would have been washerwomen, they would have been those that followed the enslaved individuals who followed their owners, their enslavers into the camps. But it also takes on another aspect in that the non-combatants not following the army so much, but of those, and I will talk about it in the lecture, that group of individuals that were what we think of as the peace churches, the Amish, the Mennonites, the Quakers, also non-combatants, very much against the idea of fighting, but not in the strictest sense to follow the army. So it's going to take on a kind of a dual role in my program.
Without giving away too much, what kind of records would people expect to hear about in this talk?
Well, they're going to hear about those individuals that were paid by the federal government for their non-combatant roles. So, as I said, a blacksmith, a teamster, someone who would have worked alongside the army, but not necessarily in the army. So, as a soldier, those individuals would have been paid by the government. And in turn, they would have been allowed. They wouldn't have had pensions, certainly, because they weren't soldiers, but they would have been paid for their participation and their role in the military, but equally important. So, and those records, we're very fortunate, at least during the Civil War period, they're pretty well documented, and those records are in the National Archives in Washington.
Okay. Talk to me about the American Protective League.
Oh, yes. An organization that, quite frankly, probably should never have existed. So they were kind of a pseudo-patriotic organization that came about and was born out of what happened in the opening months of World War One. So Europe is embroiled in war in August 1914. We become engaged in the war April 6th, 1917, after Woodrow Wilson, our sitting president, had long declared our neutrality. However, neutrality does not mean non-involvement. We were involved in other ways, but this organization was formed in the opening months of the war. They were attached to our United States Department of Justice. They were given almost unwielding power to arrest, detain, and in many cases, uh, take away the civil liberties through the help of the Department of Justice to apprehend those men, such as slackers, those that failed to register for the draft, individuals who were suspected of disloyalty, enemy aliens, those deemed enemies of the state during the period of World War One. We were going through a period of time in our country where there was a lot going on, where there was a lot of hate and a lot of ill feeling towards German Americans and other ethnic groups. So this talk focuses on that organization, their birth, the work they did, and of course when they eventually were dismantled.
Are there records within this organization that would help flesh out a family history?
Absolutely, yes. These are another record group that comes from the National Archives. They're in a number of different record groups, so they're not just one record group, kind of the be all. You have to go and be willing to search in multiple groups of records. So the original FBI records are in record group 65. It's a large collection of those records. You'll have to go through record group 94, the Adjutant General. You're going to find files and case investigations in there, among other record groups from our archives. There were newspapers and newsletters published, and then, of course, what they touched other areas of research where you can search outside of the National Archives, images, information regarding the families themselves that were actually involved in, who were actually operatives, and they actually wore badges on their chest, which almost looked like a police badge, but it would note their position of operative or agent, if you will. And they have records of those individuals as well that were granted that office.
Seems like a kind of a story that could alter the way a family looks at their own history sometimes.
Oh, and it's an under talked about topic. I don't really know of hardly anyone who speaks about this set of records, and it's just something that really needs to be talked about and brought up.
Yeah. I'll admit I'm one of those weird people that likes to go on Google Patents and just look through patent records myself, just for fun, because there's always some interesting stuff to be found there. You have a talk on unlocking the records of the United States Patent Office. Talk to me about what you think, where that came from. What made you go down that rabbit hole?
Well, you completely shifted there from military to non-military with no warning on your part, but that's okay. I can shift accordingly. Actually, my interest in patent records actually came about from my going on eBay, and I have a lot of interest in inventors, just in general. Patents have been around since the colonial period. And of course, the wording of patents and copyrights is woven into the fabric of our Constitution as well. And I actually have a couple of family members who were authorized and granted patents. So of course, my interest stems from wanting to learn more about their personal story beyond the usual things: birth, death, marriage, census records. I mean, the usual records. To find something about them that might be a newfound treasure that I would normally not even think about. And patent records supplied that for me. And when I was on eBay, I didn't find one of my own family members, but I found a patent. It was a photograph, actually, of a man holding an invention. His name was Henry Johnson. He's from Washington, D.C., and he patented a conductor's punch. And he's pictured seating at a table, and in his hand, he is holding the actual punch. And I found the original patent record, which is in Kansas City, Missouri, where he requested to be granted the patent. He had an attorney put forth all the paperwork. He had witnesses, and there was a drawing of the patent of the punch. And I looked at my image from about 1890, and I'm like, oh my God, this is exactly the same image of what I see pictured on the model. So my interest grew from there, of course, and I became hugely interested and eventually turned it into a full-length lecture.
It's interesting because I don't think people think to look necessarily in patent records for an ancestor. Although I know we all have ancestors who were probably pretty talented and may have applied for a patent at some point. So it's kind of an interesting source to look at.
Yeah, and it's a good one, too, because it's one that OGS, I don't recall, has had in the past. So I think it would be, I think it's going to be a very popular topic.
Hi, everyone. Noel Poirier here, Executive Director of the Ohio Genealogical Society and your host for the Ohio Roots podcast. Did you know you can help preserve the past and empower the future? Your donation to the Ohio Genealogical Society helps protect vital family history records and supports research for generations to come. Visit www.ogs.org/donate and give today. Thank you so much for your support. Get ready for the 2025 OGS Annual Conference coming to Sharonville, Ohio, April 29th through May 2nd, 2026. Join genealogists and family historians from across the country for 4 days of inspiring sessions, expert speakers, research tools, and community connections. Don't miss your chance to discover new stories and strengthen your family history skills. Registration opens November 28th, so be sure to register and be part of Ohio's premier genealogy event. Because you cover so many different areas in your talks, and I apologize, I'm jumping around with them, but one of the things you're talking about are records of justice of the peace. Talk to me a little bit about that discussion, and are we talking about justices of the peace anywhere or in specific areas?
So my focus is going to be on the United States. However, the Office of the Justice of the Peace, which, by the way, was not always called a JP, that office later evolved to be called district justices in many states, Pennsylvania and Maryland being two of them as an example. But in cities, they were otherwise known as aldermen. I'm sure you're familiar with the term alderman, so that's what they were called. But they're the same office. I want you to think of the JP as kind of the literal keeper of the peace, because that's what he was. He was a man who, well, and women, of course, would have been, permitted in that job, later on. But he was a man who typically had very little training in the law. However, he applied his trade through a lot of common sense. And his was, the JP was the lowest level of the law. It was a means for two parties to come together to argue their dispute with one another. The JP would hear both sides, make a decision. If the decision was not amenable to either side, then it would continue on to the next level of law, which would, of course, entail, the county level and possibly even a jury trial or something to that nature. And my interest from that actually stems from one of my own direct ancestors. So I'm direct descendant of a man named Tobias Bender, who was a JP and was reelected 6 times to the same office. And he was a school teacher, and his penmanship was because he was a teacher. I mean, it certainly makes sense. But his penmanship was amazing. And many of the original land deeds, so JPs often witnessed those, have his signature from the period in which he served. And my interest started from one of my own family members and the desire to learn more about the office and what it entailed. So that's how I came to do this topic.
Would records for somebody like a JP or an alderman or a magistrate, would they be kept in similar places in similar states, or is it kind of a crapshoot?
Well, I wouldn't define it as a crapshoot. I would more define it as you have to know the law for your individual state. as I said, the iteration of the name changes from state to state, time to time, from the decade to the next decade. So you have to be able to be willing to adapt to those changes. And when you delve deeper into the law, well, things have become a lot clearer as to what the office entailed, what the responsibilities were, what sort of training was required, and in turn, where the records are kept. Many of the records are going to be at the state level. This is not a federal office. This is a state or local level office. And in turn, many of those records, at least for Tobias, were held and are held still at the Pennsylvania State Archives in Harrisburg.
Okay. Yeah, I'm curious because I know, in Ohio has their own weird setup for localities and how they manage things. So sometimes the records are very scattered, and in some places they're a lot more centralized. So I was just curious as to where folks would have to look for those kind of things. Again, addressing the diversity of your subjects that you're talking about this year, what made you want to tackle West Virginia?
Well, I tackled West Virginia because I have an interest in the state's early history. Well, it goes without saying. You're a military historian as I am, and we share many of the same interests. And we know and understand historically that West Virginia was carved out of Virginia. It shares many of the same early laws. And in turn, the birth of the state, occurs right in the middle of the war. Government in Wheeling for the Unionists who occupied what area became West Virginia, and they more or less operated as a separate government with elected officials. And the rest of the state, before it became a separate state, still was Virginia. And there were areas certainly that were still pro-Southern Confederate. So it was one of those states where literally brother fought against brother. It was deeply rooted into violence, and that carried over, I think, into the Reconstruction era. And my bachelor's degree was actually awarded to me from Shepherd University in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. So that's where I went to school for my undergrad work, and I was in the Civil War program. I lived in Martinsburg, about 9 miles from Shepherdstown, and in my one of my final semesters at school, because I was in that program, we had to do research on a soldier who had served, and the professor gave the parameters, and each year he changed it. So the year I did the class, we had to choose someone who was physically at the Battle of Gettysburg, had to have been at the battle and participated. They had to have been in the 3rd West Virginia Cavalry, so that was a 1864 and later unit, and they would have had to have survived the war and received a pension from the federal government. So I kind of took the professor's instructions to the breaking point, and my guy was a man named John LeMaster. Well, LeMaster was from Martinsburg, but he was in the Confederate Army as a Confederate soldier in the 2nd Virginia Infantry at the Battle of Gettysburg. After the battle ended and the 2nd Virginia retreated down what is now I-81, they passed through West Virginia. So West Virginia is pretty new. And he and about 50 some other men from his company and regiment deserted. He laid low for several months, went out towards western Grafton, out in western West Virginia. And he and his younger brother Theodore joined the 3rd West Virginia Cavalry. So my connection to the state and wanting to know more was deeply rooted in my research paper, which was a senior level capstone project that I had no choice but to do.
Yeah, it's my interest in West Virginia is from the 18th century, but I share your I will second your statement about it's an important part of the country for those of us who study military history.
Absolutely.
Manifest destiny is something we're taught since we're little kids in elementary school, or at least we're taught the word. And you're doing a program on the Mexican-American War and territorial expansion. Can you chat a little bit about that? It's kind of a forgotten kind of conflict, or at least it's kind of glanced over in most people's experience in studying American history.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. A lot of people, I think, consider the War of 1812 kind of the 19th century's forgotten war. But I would also make the argument that the Mexican War also has a lot of forgotten parts that are often overlooked. And this whole idea of manifest destiny was simply an idea that was put forth by the Democratic Party at the time, James Polk's party. Polk's our sitting president. And he and his supporters were all about the idea of expansion. And remember, the Compromise of 1820 was still in place. We did not have the Compromise of 1850. There was no popular sovereignty. We didn't see that till 1854 with the Kansas-Nebraska Act being passed. So it was believed, at least by our political leaders, that any territory gained through manifest destiny, and that idea stems from the fact that we, as a republic, it's our duty, it's our sworn initiative, and it's our right to have our country expand from sea to sea. And of course, California is proof of that, because in California, it becomes a separate state in 1850 under the flag of the Republican Party. Very early on, it's the free state. And in turn, this all plays heavily into that whole notion and idea of an ideology of manifest destiny. So the lecture will cover political, social, economic, and of course, military research, as they all kind of are interconnected for this war, as we talk about those events leading up to, during, and after the war, as it leads into the Civil War, because they are all connected.
For those who do genealogy or family history who might be a little bit kind of intimidated by military records and legal records, what kind of encouragement would you give them to kind of push them through that?
Well, my immediate thought is to, and yes, it can seem daunting at times. I do agree with you. My immediate thought would be to kind of take a look, kind of sit down, take a slower look or a more relaxed look at the records. Don't get overwhelmed by what you see. There's a lot of law, draped inside these records. I think if you get a firm grasp on some of the major points that the law is trying to impose on us, I think it makes those records that you research and the families that you find and the narratives and the personal stories, I think it'll come full circle, and it will allow you to understand. And I think it'll give you newfound respect for your family, whatever their decision was at the time. But you'll understand, certainly by researching that, you'll understand why they came to make the decisions they did.
Well, Michael Strauss, thank you so much for joining me today on the OGS Ohio Roots podcast to discuss what you're going to be presenting at the 2026 OGS conference in Sharonville, Ohio this year. I appreciate you taking some time out of your day. So thanks again, Michael.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Well, that was Michael Strauss, military historian, genealogist, and one of our featured speakers at the 2026 Ohio Genealogical Society Conference. From spies and slackers to patent records and Mountain State research, his sessions promise to open up entirely new record sets for your family history. Make plans to join us. You won't want to miss it. And thank you for listening to the OGS Ohio Roots podcast. If you enjoy listening to the Ohio Roots podcast, we would really appreciate it if you could go to whatever platform it is that you listen and give us a good review. Reviews help us get more listeners and reach more people with Ohio Roots and what we're trying to do with the Ohio Genealogical Society. So please leave us a nice review, and thanks for listening.
The Ohio Roots podcast is brought to you by the Ohio Genealogical Society, the premier gateway for discovering your Ohio family history. Hosted by OGS Executive Director Mill Poyer and edited by Luke Poyer. Theme song is Beautiful Ohio, recorded by Bob Stanley and his orchestra in 1944. To learn more about joining the Ohio Genealogical Society, visit www.ogs.org.